either live by the gun or you die by the sword.
Welcome to the Good, the Bad, and the Weird Spotlights. I'm Nico.
And I'm Chris.
And this year, we have actually decided to give October a theme.
Yes.
We partly came inspired from SP film viewers and talking to Paul about folk horror films. So we are doing Folktober.
Yes.
So we thought we'd kick it off a little bit with our a brief discussion of the genre itself. Not a full deep dive because there are much better resources out there than us, but we still wanted to just kind of talk about it in general because we've hinted on it and we've talked a little bit in pieces of it, but haven't really given it the dedication it needs.
Sure, and I think it's also important to make the distinction of like what is a folk movie and what is a folk horror movie, because they are two different genres. Some of it overlaps, a lot of it really doesn't though.
Yes, no, exactly. Yeah, and part of this part of the reason I went down this rabbit hole a little bit earlier this year was specifically All the Haunts Be Ours, a compendium of folk horror, which you get that DVD set, you're good on a good basis of it.
Definitely.
It is missing like the unholy trinity such as Wicker Man, Witchfinder General, or The Blood on Satan's Claw, but it's got a wide variety of world cinema outside of like Japanese cinema and whatnot.
Sure.
So, and just heads up for everyone to look forward to. We are doing a micro review with Paul and Sophie of SP Film Viewers later this year, so definitely check that out when that comes out.
How exciting.
And before we dive into it, I do want to acknowledge our sources for this. The documentary Woodlands Dark and Days Bewitched, A History of Folk Horror, which it is 3 hours long.
It is, yeah.
But if you get a chance, it is a fantastic primer on the genre.
I fully agree. I'm so glad we stumbled upon the same documentary.
Yes. As well as Introduction to Fighting Folk Horror by Don Keatley of Lay University, and We Won't Go Back, A Watcher's Guide to Folk Horror by Howard David Ingram.
Some other bases that are really handy is if you are at all into witch history. Honestly, even though that can be separate, a lot of it ends up translating over and influencing the folk horror genre. It's very interesting. There's countless documentaries on it.
Hexen, Witchcraft Through the Ages, which we covered last year as well.
Yeah.
So, what is folk horror? Folk horror, while having key elements, can be a little bit difficult to pin down at times because it does deal with the subject of beliefs, and as such, it is subjective. But usually the tropes include some type of pagan or ancient religion or deity that's been hidden away from modern society.
Sure.
Either a group or an outsider that shouldn't be there unintentionally gets involved or is intentionally brought there, like in the case of the Wicker Man. I'm going to refer to the Wicker Man a lot because for me, I think that's the poster child of everything in folk horror.
Sure. I do think that, and like a lot of people point to that specific bullet point, a group or an outsider coming into an isolated community as part of the like key foundations to a folk horror element, and we are seeing some really interesting play on what that looks like, especially in more recent movies with the introduction of urban folk horror.
Yes, and at many times the old ways are the right ways.
Yes, even if the old ways do not necessarily make sense
or work with our modern morality.
Yes, and honestly, morality is a huge cornerstone, despite which one of these three main bullet points you look at. Morality and how the world operates, and what is considered a standard morality, usually in the point of the main character, but that can vary depending on the movie, and also letting the movie take it and turn it on its head. Again, a lot of movies change that and how that looks, but that is usually a key cornerstone element to all of them in general. However, this does differ a little bit from just religious horrors.
Yes.
So, the reason why it stands out from those is an understanding of the unknown. Most religious horrors are going to lean more towards an organized and an understanding that the audience is bringing about that religion in, as opposed to folk horror where you are not meant to know anything about the pre-context.
Yes and no on that. Because, there is that overlap. Because one of the Unholy Trilogy, or Trinity, the blood on Satan's claw
Yes.
is all about religion, and same with like Witchfinder General. So there is an overlap.
There is.
But it's I think the best way to describe it is it doesn't fall under like I don't know how popular this movie is, but The Reaping.
Sure.
Where that takes place in the South. It's from an outsider's point of view, causing friction with the crew or with the group of people that's there for Child Protective Services. But it's not folk horror because it doesn't. It's more focused on the religious aspect of it all rather than how folk horror addresses it.
Sure.
Or the Christian viewpoint. And that one's specifically about the Christian viewpoint.
Yes. Another thing that we're having to debate and as a fandom try and figure out how to incorporate is the difference in folk horror and also folk, as we're seeing more of an overlap. Folk usually just depicts old tales, usually with a moral to them, which is why folk horror takes inspiration from.
Yes.
However, more recently we're seeing a blending of the two, so we're having to kind of try and understand and interpret what those are going to look like, how they fall into the category.
Yes, and I think I have an answer to this, because when I was younger in my film watching career, I didn't know what folk horror was, and I didn't do a lot of research back in the day, so there's that.
Sure.
But it falls in line with what I called rural horror.
Yeah.
Which it falls backwoods country. So like Wrong Turn would be a folk movie because we've had that, but it's not really like that folk horror. There's not the religious aspect to it. Mm-hmm. It's very just backwoodsy. But on the other side, I'm glad you brought that up, is from what I know, I haven't seen the new Wrong Turn, but I know it takes a more folk horror route.
Mm-hmm, exactly.
And what I think it has to deal with also is elements of urban legends, which
are becoming our modern day folk tales. Mm-hmm. And that has been something that, as a especially since this genre is as old as it is, this is one of the older groups of horror. As far as a subgenre, right?
Yes, in writing in regards to that.
Yeah.
And in movies too, because the term itself originated in 1936 in the issue of the England Journal by James Campbell, where he described the ballad with freightage of superstition and folk horror, but it wasn't applied to film until 1970 with Red Copperfield, Revere of Piers Haggard's The Blood on Satan's Claw as a study of folk horror. So,
which is interesting because we definitely had folk horror movies, some of which are pinnacles of the genre, well before people were giving it a proper name.
Yeah, from 1922, Hexen, which is kind of folk horror but kind of documentary.
You could also maybe even put Nosferatu in there, depending on what level of the coin you're going for.
Nosferatu.
Yeah,
Nosferatu.
Look, he's got a lisp, and you know it. Those teeth are very much in the way of his talking.
Yeah, I mean, hell, even to a point you can consider Dracula. I mean, it's all because it does stem from Gothic literature.
Yeah, and also where we're having to draw the line at folk tales is something that has to be adjusted depending on when and where you are. We're seeing a big recent grab and inclusion in a lot of Japanese movies recently because people are recognizing those as folk horror for their own style.
Exactly. And I'm glad you brought that up too, because that was the era that I had a hard time understanding, just because the way Japan does folk horror is quite drastic than what we think of on our side usually. And it was when they were talking about Candyman.
Yes.
Where it was urbanized.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Japan has a lot of that, but even then it has older stuff like 1964's film Kwaidan or 1953. While it's not 100%, it's not a horror film in any real regard. It does have folk horror elements. Or when you came over, The Mad Fox.
Exactly.
There's folk elements just in many aspects of their films. Think of Ju-on or Ringu, where they all take place mainly in the city, but Ringu's a folk horror, or Ringu's an urban legend about a tape that kills you if you watch it in 7 days. Mm-hmm. Ringu is a curse that continues from Japanese folklore. It just happens to be in a city.
Definitely. And I think we're at a very interesting point in the horror like genre, because we've not, as a group, as a like collection of movie watchers, we've all collectively gotten this like understanding and vocabulary around what we're watching nowadays. And it's much easier to get into and understand that and find people who enjoy similar ones because of that. And we have online to talk about it and share movies now. So we're going backwards and like re-pulling stuff in. And so we are seeing a bit of a change in what we consider folk horror. And we're also seeing a change in what we consider folk movies as well. And part of that is because we're also seeing a much clearer understanding of where movies are coming from. Not just seeing like the big three, America, Asia, or America, Europe as a whole, and then like the Asian groups. We're able to separate those out and then see how very different and drastic those are and then understand it better. And I do think that it's helping, but it's also meaning that we're all a collective trying to rework what the definition is.
Exactly. And I think part of that just stems from, since the coining of the original term, the unholy trinity really defined what folk horror was in the early or late 60s, early 70s.
Definitely.
I mean, to reiterate ourselves again, the Holy Trinity is the Blood on Satan's Claw, the Wicker Man, and Witchfinder General. And those are the key surgences or the key movies that created the genre as we know it. So obviously it's going to tie back into the England, because they're all English movies.
Yes.
So it's just, it's interesting to really see how it changes, because also we got to understand that in a lot of ways, folk horror is on the fringe of horror. It's not one of the, at least previously, I'd say before the more recent resurgence with Midsommar, we really didn't see a whole lot of folk horror meet the mainstream.
Yeah, especially after the 80s.
Yeah, and I think part of that is just because it dived into an area that we weren't super interested in culturally, because when folk horror came out, a lot of it was a rejection of the gothic horror period pieces that came before, such as Hammer and Amicus Productions. And that's where I think like Dracula doesn't really fall into folk horror. It pulls from folk horror elements.
Yes.
But it's centered around the gothic drama and the melodrama behind everything that's going on.
Yes. But at the same time, movies made around the same time that were close or even used similar monster tropes do manage to make their way in because they were trying to go for a different look. It's one of those things where as moviegoers continue to grow and understand and have a better dialogue of past movies, we're going to see this change. We're also seeing a more heavy push to include urban folk as opposed to leaving it on its own as its own genre, even though it does have very distinct change from all of, especially our main trinity. A lot of people are pointing to the fact that, much like Japanese folk horror, it's more relatable to most people, and it is a point, like, we can only do we can only get so close to cosmic horror without actually being cosmic horror for so long.
Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, it's until you start showing stuff like, I mean, because we do have some of that integration, and we do, so that's the other thing too, is H.P. Lovecraft did incorporate folk horror into his work.
100%.
But he took it to space, and that's where his starts deviating from it.
And I also think part of the like way that we're right now anyway, we're having an easy definition. But a lot of us are seeing like this is going to become a problem, much how urban folk horror eventually we needed to come and address it and decide whether or not it's going to continue with that name or not. Is at the moment most cosmic horror does rather directly address, at least to the audience, that this is otherworldly and from another place. Whereas folk, usually it is left up to interpretation, imagination, or it is given like a pass and no definition at all.
Well, and that's actually one of the things is that, or one of the themes of folk horror, is that it's rooted in the land itself specifically.
Yes.
So, such as in like 1983's Eyes of Fire, where the settlers, people who shouldn't be there, settle in a sacred land where all the blood of the land flows. That's what's going to happen. In more modern context, we have something like Norai the Curse, which is a Japanese flick about a town that got buried underwater. I mean, in some regards, I guess Mushishi at times it doesn't fully enter like the horror area, but it borderlines it quite a bit, especially like towards the end of the franchise in the live action, which is directed by the dude who did Akira, by the way.
Look at him go.
Yeah, but it does borderline that horror element. And again, it all ties back to the land. I think part of that is just, especially in European folk horror or Western-based folk horror, is that we have this romanticization of pagan cults outliving the Christianification of Europe, which we talked about that quite a bit in Hexen. That never happened.
Not in the way that they're explained.
No. Any traces of any pagan cults, we have imagery of them, but as a belief system, gone. Just don't exist. But I think we still have that idea that we want the old ways to still live. We don't want them to die. We want to still be connected to the land. And we see that in the US as well with like something, I'd be stretching it if I would call Pumpkinhead folk horror, but it's close.
But it's close. And I think the other thing that helps push it, and is something that it's something that trends a little bit more across no matter what, is this leaning towards a very hard lesson in the morality, and even lessons and morals that would have been at some point more appropriate for kids or just like a fun-ish, scary story, when broken down and thought about, are typically more on the gruesome and bloody side. Think of original Grimm tales. Yeah,
no, exactly. Another example is, or another aspect of folk horror, and again, this applies to a lot of movies, is an identity crisis of belief.
Yes.
Which, for example, we see Children of the Corn.
A good example.
Which it's a crisis of what we want small town America to be versus how Children of the Corn ends up becoming. Again, tying back to the land, older gods.
Sure, and even a good example for the characters themselves having to deal with it and the audience try and keep up would be like The Witch, where we're having to see a deviation of very strict morality.
Or being too strict for the people who are supposed to be very strict.
Yes.
And just the hubris of it all. And that's where I think like in modern times, I think of the folk horror I've seen, granted it's not a whole lot of modern folk horror, but I think The Witch is that prime example of what we want in new folk horror. But I know it's on the artsier side and whatnot.
It is. I would say for most people it's a little much to get through. Not necessarily horror-wise, but just, it's a little dry.
Yeah.
Delightful. I loved every minute of it, but it's dry.
Yeah. And in a way, I mean, you can see the continuation in Robert Eggers' next film, The Lighthouse, which...
Oh, for sure.
...is a folk horror in its own way, too, where it deals with sailing curses and lore. They're going crazy. And, I mean, granted, they did. Max Miller, Tasting History, just went down a little rabbit hole of that, too, so...
Another thing that has been interesting and of development in it as time has progressed, and I do think that the Trinity really helped influence this, is older examples of what we now think of as folk horror tend to lean more towards the folly and man as the monster. And while the main trilogy definitely kept that overarching theme, it became less of monster in the more literal sense of the term, and moved more towards the overarching concept of what is good and evil in a man.
Well, and I don't even know if it 100% goes there. I think it more so goes in the direction that it's man thinks, or we put man forward as the monster, but really it's the indifference of nature.
Sure.
That really gets to, and I can see where you get with...
It's definitely a theme in a lot of them.
Yeah, I can see where you're pulling from, like, man is the monster. We do have that in, like, The Wicker Man and movies like that.
Sure.
But in the other side of it, too, and this is why folk horror is so hard to really pinned down is because it is interpretive, where I'm
Yes.
sure some of the movies I've brought up, some people won't think are folk horror.
Yes,
Or vice versa. Movies that I don't think are folk horror are clearly folk horror.
and a part of that is also where you're getting your folktales from.
Mm-hmm.
In America, we really don't have a whole lot of our own. There's really only 2 that most school children get told, and 3 if you're really stretching it.
What are those 3? I'm curious because
Yeah, so there is a folk chapter in most American public schools, or at least there was ancient times ago, where you learned about the giant lumberjack and his blue ox.
oh, okay, Paul Bunyan. Oh, like that Pecos Bill, that one movie where the kid meets those 2.
Yeah.
Okay.
We learn about Johnny Appleseed, who, whether or not based on real people, almost America's too young. Everything's gonna be based on someone at some point. And same thing with
Sleepy Hollow.
Sleepy Hollow or John Henry Jr. Like, there's a handful of ones that, like, we get told as, like, fun tales for kids. And part of that is because America's young, and we don't have a very, like, deep sense yet.
Mm-hmm.
We also don't have the innate desire to terrify our children that a lot of European countries had. And I think that's something that you can see very clearly with where people are pulling their ideas for folk horror and, like, their definitions themselves. People who grew up and are more used to the Germanic versions of, like, folk stories tend to find ones that are more, man, when you step out of line or create a fuss, then something extraordinarily terrible happens. Or, on the flip side, some of them who are more used to a different system, you end up finding ones where, like, if you go against said unsaid rules or unknown logic, then you have a problem.
Yeah.
Again, it all depends on where you're pulling from, where that movie's pulling from, too.
Yeah, well, I think, again, it does go down to some regional differences, and I will say this is one area that I am lacking in. I don't know a whole lot of American folk horror films. I think
a lot of them are more recent, and that's kind of the problem. Or they're attempting to interpret European.
Yeah, or there are obscure ones like Jugface, which I know is not a very common one. But I think part of it too is, I hope we do see a surgence of this, especially with, like, how Predator's gone back to the Native Americans. I don't know too many of them. I know the couple I'm familiar with it's utilizing, like, Indian religion in a way that in a way that doesn't really accurately portray, but it's a white interpretation of it, specifically, like, for example, Pet Sematary.
Yes.
Or it's in all the Haunts Beyars collection, Clear Cut, which is about a white man trying to he says he's trying to help the natives, but he ends up going on, like, an actual revenge course against white people and taking revenge.
I think some that are probably, like, the folk horror, like, America's one of those weird ones, but it's also the easiest to point to and say, like, this is where maybe some stuff needs to be looked at and decide whether or not, like, we need to have a branching.
Yeah.
And, like, an example of that would be, like, Cabin in the Woods. Arguably has the elements of folk horror to some extent, but at the same time is very American based, and a lot of our spooky or quote unquote morality lesson learnings are 80s horror movies.
But see, that's where I'll say that yes, there's elements in Cabin in the Woods, but it doesn't meet that because of how it ends, and just like it's not to all the other horror franchises, but it enters that H.P. Lovecraft cosmic horror realm, and so that's what pulls it away from folk horror.
Exactly.
But and granted, I'm not very versed, but something I noticed, especially in Antlers, a more recent kind of that went under the radar folk horror because it was supposed to come out when the pandemic started. They took the story of the Wendigo, and that's one thing that's been very popular, at least in the last couple. Honestly, 5-6 years.
Just Americanized monsters in general have been popular.
Yeah, but what Wendigo did, and they took the one Native American character in it, and they just ended up giving them a side role, basically.
Yeah, there's definitely some work to be done, because, let's be honest, like, most of the monsters that run around
Mhm.
in, like, American folktales, they're silly.
Yeah.
They're a pair of walking pants.
Yeah.
Or a man with some booty cheeks and a moth head. Like, not really there for the, like, level of horror we're at, but at the same time, like, we could get there.
Yeah. And I think, again, going back to Pumpkinhead, the more I talk about Pumpkinhead, it seems more and more folk horror. Actually, I think it probably is. But it's those lores that we try and reinterpret. But then we see something like in Australia, a country that has a very similar history to the U.S., they have films such as Kadachi and The Dreaming, which is all about Native American revenge.
Sure.
And I think part of it, too, is we have the Western genre, where that heavily influenced the portrayal of natives, where they were almost always the bad guys, even in, like...
Yeah, unfortunately.
Bone Tomahawk, which
or
I don't
they were
really...
the useless sidekick, Sea Lone Ranger.
Yeah, exactly. And it's just... I don't think we've had that resurgence in the U.S. because
not yet.
And it goes so far back, like The Witch is set in America, and Midsummer's set in Sweden. But The Witch is so far back in our history; it's super early on.
And honestly, the way it portrays itself, it comes across as the European setting and styling.
Yeah, or we have portrayals of hoodoo and voodoo that get stereotyped.
That's true. It would be. That is something that I think American horror knows that we have a problem. We had a huge problem in the 70s and 80s, and it continued into the 90s despite, by that point, us knowing better. So, yes, I agree. There's definitely room for updating and researching, especially since we're seeing good folk horror, and especially more modern folk horror coming out of a lot of other countries. But at the same time, we're also seeing new and interesting interpretations of those folk horrors from places like Japan that has agreed, like, yes, we understand folk horror, we're making a folk horror, but it's Japanese. Deal with it.
Yeah. A lot of times it just comes across as just horror.
Yes.
And we do have...
But when you ask Japanese movies watchers, they will, with their whole chest, say this is folk horror.
Well, I don't know that 100%, but we do have to also make a distinction between... We're getting to that era where it is hard to make that distinction because technically, in my opinion, Slender Man starts hitting that era.
It gets close.
For a more Western standpoint. But like in Japan, because this is a little bit of my bread and butter, Ju-on and The Grudge are drastically different than something like Death Forest 1 through 5.
Sure.
Where
I can see that.
Death Forest feels more technologically horror, but it also I only say that because it comes from a game, and that's the weird thing where we have this blending where the games are influencing the creation of folk horror.
And eventually we're gonna have to like come to that bridge though, because we are getting to a place where movies and media and technology have been around long enough that it's going to get to a point where it's going to have to be present in these movies, and not just in the like, oh, the character has a cell phone sort of way, but in the like, written horror is no longer being published, Mary Shelley Frankenstein style. It's being published on, creepypasta in the early 90s.
Yeah, basically folk horror fanfics.
Exactly, which eventually get turned into like urban legend. Like, even if you haven't read the original threads of like Jeff the Killer or Slender Man, you know the character, you at least know what it kind of looks like. Games, movies have all been based off of it. Whether or not you want to participate in the legend, much like the rest of folk horror, or folk in general, you're incorporated in it.
Again, where like the genius of Japanese folk horror and just how their culture works, or at least how we perceive it in the U.S.
Sure.
Like the Ringu. Ringu is the perfect example of it's an urban legend, but it starts incorporating technology, and it starts just weirdly and perfectly weaving together all those elements in something that did become itself a cultural phenomenon, which did lead to Ju-on. Yeah.
And while I will stand behind the statement that, like, the inclusion of more modern interpretations of folk and the definition of folk are going to have to happen, and I like them. We're seeing them in the, like, urban horror folk movies coming out. the understanding of, like, and the imagery that, like, early witch trials in America specifically had on the general concept of this genre play a huge and heavy hand still. So it's hard to get away from that.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I think we will have to see it change, all like the Candyman.
Sure.
Which, again, I think that's probably one of our more recent ones. Well, I haven't seen the new one, but like the first one at least.
Yeah, it's definitely... I know a lot of people stand behind the idea that it is a folk horror because it comes from folk that they are used to or they have heard or grew up with. And
and on top of that, it's a play on the Bloody Mary.
Yeah, which, I mean, is a little silly, but I could see someone working in. And then there's also ones that, granted, fall short just from a few different standpoints, but do come across the ideas of more modern folk elements that we don't necessarily consider or think about, like Trick or Treat, jack-o'-lantern carving, the whole ritual around modern Halloween.
No, exactly. Yeah, and I think All the Haunts Be Ours does bring up a good point, is that folk horror doesn't operate in a specific genre. And I think that's why it's been so hard for us, like, specifically pin down, where we said these movies have this element to it, or it's kind of like this. Like, hell, even The Color Out of Space still has the folkish elements to it.
Yes, and I think that's why I stand by when I say it's one of the oldest styles of horror, because it's kind of in the same vein of, like, gore horror. Lots of horror can have gore and also be other things.
Yes.
And I think folk is also in that same part, but there's now a, like, interest and, like, a wave behind folk. And so, unlike gore, where it's very easy to quickly be like, yes, there is gore, and this is one of those ones that a lot of people want to take and dissect more, because there is so much more into it. There's, motives and stories behind each one of these movies. Yeah,
no. And, yeah, there's just a lot to it. And part of what I think is interesting, too, in folk horror is how, like many other horror films I've talked about, specifically when we talked about Silent Hill, is the power of women in folk horror. And
I think a lot of that has to come down to the old witch trials and how those influenced this genre.
Yes. And I mean, we even see it across the board in, like, again, going back to Ringu. Where I'm just using some of the more well-known examples.
Sure. But it's also just a classic older than movie trope for horror in general is having women play either the monster role, which is typically the unexpected, or being told they are the monster role, and then there is punishment for that deed.
Yes. No, exactly. Or, like, it also stems from that kind of fear of femininity and the female leadership. I mean, that's where we start to see some of these movies where we have female leaders, and
yes, and I think you're right. I think for a while, especially in, like, the 60s, we saw an uptick in, like, female leads in, like, zombie movies. And folk horror also went through it to an extent after, I would say, more recent ones.
Yes.
At least for America and European folk.
Well, and All the Haunts Be Ours does bring up that, specifically in the 80s and the 90s, we saw witchy people, or witches, become the symbol of girl power, like The Craft they mentioned, but for me,
honestly, even the remake.
Still haven't seen either of them.
Oh my god, I own them. We're watching them this year.
And while I know it's not horror, it still has those elements.
Practical
magic. Yes.
Yes, a fantastic one. And honestly, like,
hell, Hocus Pocus.
Hocus Pocus, and I know it's not really a movie, but both Buffy the Vampire Slayer and Sabrina the Teenage Witch had a huge impact on how we perceive the witchy, spooky genre. It also opened the floodgates for a lot of girls growing up who were into somewhat more spooky things to see elements of something that was traditionally used as, like, a vilification tool, and to see it as a power tool. And so we are finally seeing, like, the repercussions of people having grown up with spooky.
Yeah. I mean, no, you see it in horror. I think horror is probably and I still stand by that, I think horror is the genre that is the most feminist, to give it a term, where it's very much so embracing the base, or it's embracing the traditional term of being a woman, but also that's the reason they survive. That's the reason they get the powers. Like, we see it in, like, Carrie, when she starts developing her psychic powers, when she starts menstruating.
Yes.
Like, and not folk horror, but, like, teeth.
Yes, and I think a lot of it comes... And whether or not you watch a movie that claims to be, like, in that, like, subcategory, which a lot of them share a lot of things with folk horror, and agree or not, is part of the, like, dialogue around horror that I don't think a lot of other movies get to have.
No.
Because there has to be a discussion and some form of intelligence put between pen and paper when writing horror of any kind. Otherwise, you're not going to have anything to show at the end of it, unlike an action movie where you can just have fight scenes and stupidity, and you'll end up with something people will watch.
Yeah.
Might not be good, but it will be entertaining. Same thing with a romance film. Like, romance and horror are those two genres where you have to put in some level of effort, even if that effort is not enjoyed or reciprocated by people watching it.
Yeah. And specifically on, like, romance is really hard to make it interesting and not be really dumb.
Yeah, but that's something that we're seeing, and I think romance and horror go hand in hand because there is an oversaturation of both. There's just one's a little bit more accessible than the other, at least right now. Like, the ease at which you can turn on the TV and find a channel on that shows almost nothing but dumb romance films is very easy. Horror's a little harder, but we've reached a point where you can get almost endless amounts of mediocre horror if you want.
Tubi.
Yeah. But both genres, even if you are just writing for a paycheck, even if you're just writing to, like, get a quick movie out, you still have to have some premise of idea to go behind it. Unlike action or adventure movies where you really don't. You can just rehash something that's already been done.
Yeah.
So even if you're not trying, you still have to have a concept, and I think that's why folk horror overlaps so nicely with a lot of this.
Exactly. Again, it's not a specific genre, but it operates within a bunch of them.
It does. And I think that's why so many people like folk horror. Is it's easy to, for the most part, find something that will interest you. If you're into the witchy styling, there's going to be a bunch in that category. If you're into the more feminist styling, a whole bunch of that styling as well. But all of them have a feel, a, like, certain styling base point that you can trust. Kind of like going to McDonald's when you're out of state. It might not be exactly the same, but you kind of know what you're going to get.
Exactly. So, before we do conclude this discussion, I do want to talk about the revival a little bit. We'll get more into it in our first episode.
Yes.
But I think specifically Midsummer is that turning point.
It is definitely the most recognizable.
Yeah, where we have this kind of resurgence. And I know there has been stuff that's been coming out since then, but I haven't really gotten into it. I've just been busy. But I don't think it hit the resurgence that you and I were hoping for when we first watched Midsummer.
We were so excited. We were so excited. Yes.
But I do think part of that is, in fact, due to this kind of rise in association with the art house, or the term that I don't really care for, elevated horror, where they're trying to make it something more than a good horror film with elements. They're trying to cover the story with... They're trying to cover a certain story with folk elements.
Yes, and I think that has been something in a lot of more mainstream movies that come out of the gate saying folk, like Midsummer, or... I know some people are in there, but the Blair Witch Project is a good example where they come out saying, like, this is what we're aiming at, right? And whether or not they hit that target is then always up for debate. Some succeed, some are more on the fence. And then on top of that, there is then this expectation that there is meant to be more deep dive and thought behind it. Because part of that being because of the main three that people know of for... Like, the Holy Trinity set a precedence for having thought-provoking horror, which is not a bad thing, and I'm all for it. However, that level of deep dive and dissection those three movies have withstood over the decades is so much more than I think most movies are, like, capable or meant to have. And because of that, like, we are seeing this interesting, like, there's an interest. People are wanting to see it. But we also have the ability to watch 20 different people dissect it within an inch of its life. Some hold up, some don't. And then some of them come out and say, like, we knew you were going to dissect us. Looking at you, Blair Witch Project. And so we purposefully put in all of these extra stupid things to, be a problem.
Yeah.
Or to be a puzzle sort of thing.
I'm going to argue against the Blair Witch just a little bit. Yes, I will agree it is in the realm of folk horror, but I don't think it was trying to be what Midsommar was.
No.
I think part of it is the reason it hasn't taken off is because folk horror, in my understanding and my exploration of it, has always been about more towards the common viewer, whereas Midsommar, while it was marketed, and granted this is A24...
The marketing was bad.
Right, A24 becoming more associated with the art house scene. It gives it that really pretentious, inaccessible labeling to it, where it doesn't make you really want to go see it unless you want to see an art house film. A lot of times, even though we do cover these types of movies, we want to go into a folk horror film and just have it be a dumb horror flick. That's why I would say Blair Witch hits that, because it does have folk elements, but it's just a dumb horror film.
Yes, though I will say part of the reason why I think people dissect it and Midsommar similarly but come to different conclusions is where Blair Witch purposefully put in what they thought was going to be fun or Easter eggs or puzzles for people to solve.
Yeah.
Midsommar didn't, but Midsommar also, I think, came out of the gate with, and this is something that the modern ones are having to deal with, because, like, things like The Witch were not advertised to the masses, right? Like, when it came out, you could find previews, if you were in the right circles, you could know that it was coming.
If you were going to horror films at the time, because that's how I found out about it.
However, if you were just a general mainstream moviegoer, you were never going to hear about The Witch.
Yeah.
Midsommar was advertised on before normal movies. That's how I originally heard about it. And I'm glad I was the one in our friend group to go see it with you, and not some of our other groups, because it was poorly advertised for the general masses.
Yes. Well, and again, this also just shows, like, the level of A24 when I found out about them versus when Midsommar came out.
And that's one of the things that folk horror has always, at least more recently, people have leaned in towards, is trying to have it be something that is thought-provoking, but to do that means that it's going to have to be a film that you can't just blindly go and be like, I like horror, and go to see. It's not going to be the same thing, right?
No.
But because of that, a lot of people find it difficult to give examples of movies that are not from ye oldie times, or almost unheard of, or so foreign and unheard of, so that they're hard to get a hold of and watch. But that's kind of the thing now. We've reached a point where it's easier to get a hold of these films. Not just physical copies, but you can get digital copies of a lot of them pretty easily.
Yeah. Or the opposite, where I want to get a physical copy. I think I can get it from England, but physical copy of The Ritual.
Yeah.
But you can't get that in the US because it was a Netflix exclusive.
Exactly.
Or Netflix original. That's what they're calling their bullshit.
Yeah, that is what they call their bullshit. But it's one of those things that because people are starting to have more access to these, we're seeing a huge branching out in it, and that's something I'm all for. I love being in the middle of a mess, and folk horror is currently in the middle of a mess. But I like that because it means I'm going to learn about movies that I wouldn't have heard of otherwise. And even if 20 years down the road, people come back and are like, yeah, that movie's not folk horror at all. That movie's actually, I don't know, trash can raccoon horror. I didn't know that genre existed at the time. We didn't have a term for it. Eventually we are, because we're going to build up enough, like, easily accessible, and people have seen it in movies. You're no longer going to be, like, talking to one guy on a forum hoping that he's seen it too. Yeah,
I'll shoot a raccoon horror film for you.
Thank you, I appreciate that. I'm sure it's out there.
I'm sure there is. I mean, it's probably under some nature horror. Just I'm guessing it's probably under the lines of, like, Night of the Shrew.
No, I want 3 raccoons in a trench coat playing a man, and I don't want you to know that it's 3 raccoons in a trench coat until the end. He lives in the walls and scutters around, kind of like the boy.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, so I think that concludes our talk on our brief discussion on folklore. I mean, brief as in 45 minutes, but...
But honestly, brief compared to a lot of the good listening that I did trying to get my head wrapped around what this is.
Yeah, no, it's something that I am definitely going to keep an eye out for, especially since my rabbit hole is more and more becoming Eastern Asian.
and I think part of that is, like we said, like it's getting easier and easier to get a hold of these movies.
Yeah.
And so that's part of the like fun is like going through what some guy way back in the day who had them declared because he owned them. Mm-hmm. Now we all get to try and find them and watch them and decide if we agree.
Yeah, exactly. So this has been the Good, the Bad, and the Weird this has been the Good, the Bad, and the Weird Spotlights.
Thanks for listening.
Peace. Thank you for stopping by this here town of the Good, the Bad, and the Weird. We appreciate your listenership, and if you want more of our takes in your life, feel free to check us out on social media at The Good, the Bad, and the Weird Podcast, or TGTBTW for short. As well, if we missed a fact, your favorite part of a movie, or just have a suggestion and want to reach out and say howdy, feel free to email us at tgtbtwpodcast@gmail.com. And feel free to join our Discord at The Good, the Bad, and the Weird Podcast, where we talk about movies, just share random banter here and there. And always, check out our podcasters, streamers, or any other content creator we shout out in our episodes. We really appreciate it. And as always, thank you for listening. Peace.